Good evening. Welcome to the book launch event, virtual book launch for Michael Paddock for Bridging Barriers, How a Community Changed Its Future with help from EWB USA volunteers. I'm so happy you can join us. I heard that a lot of Marquette University students are attending, so a big shout out to Marquette students. Thank you for attending. Mike Paddock, I am Shannon Shizaki, the owner of Orange Hat Publishing, and also joining us today is the founder of Engineers Without Borders, Bernard Amadei, and also the CEO of Engineers Without Borders, Kathy Leslie. And then once I'm done talking, we'll have Michael Paddock do about a 30-minute presentation with a little excerpt from the book. And then also there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. So if you have any questions along the way, you can chat them, put them into the chat box, and we'll be able to hopefully respond to most of your questions. So I would just want to tell a little bit of backstory about how Michael came to know us at Orange Hat Publishing. He contacted me back in November and he said, let's meet. I have an idea for a book. So he came to my office and he said, you know, I'm an engineer, not a writer. I just have these wonderful stories that I want to share. So as you can imagine as a publisher, I do receive a lot of submissions of different books and different stories. And so of course, when I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, well, let's see how much you can write. I need you to send it to me so I can read it. So he did end up sending it. And one thing about Mike that we love is that he's very team oriented. So all of his emails start with Team Orange, hey, Shannon and team. So he's very much of a let's collaborate together kind of guy. So we love that about him. So it turns out when I read it with the team, we're all like, but this engineer can really write. Like he can really write. I don't know what he was doing. He was setting up our expectations for very minimal, but once you receive the book, you will realize how captivating it is to be in Guatemala and see through the eyes of an engineer and a volunteer and the community and the culture. You realize how much of an impact Engineers Without Borders really is globally. And we are just honored to be part of that mission to spread the word and be part of the culture. That was one of actually my favorite parts of Michael's book, is where he talks about how nothing is imposed upon the culture of where Engineers Without Borders goes. It's all about what the community decides as a group collectively. No matter how long it takes, everyone has to be on the same page. And I'll let him talk more about that, but I just wanted to say what an honor it is, and thank you so much again for joining us. And if you are interested in purchasing the book, you can just visit orangehatpublishing.com/bookshop, and you'll be able to scroll down and see an exclusive signed copy by Kathy Leslie and Bernard Amadei and Michael Paddock. So without further ado, thank you, Michael, for joining us, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Shannon. Wow, you guys, I am absolutely overwhelmed by the turnout and all the support that, frankly, I've received from everybody leading up to this book. So thank you so much for supporting me tonight. I'd like to thank the Rotary Club of Milwaukee, of course, and Orange Hat for jointly hosting this particular event. Certainly Shannon and her team at Orange Hat, who have been amazingly patient with me as a new author. And my wife can attest that you have to have a lot of patience working with me. And at the same time, what I really enjoyed working with Shannon and her team is that they were really able to listen to me and what I wanted to accomplish as far as the goals for this particular book. You see, to write this book, it really wasn't an option for me. It was more of an obligation. It's an obligation to pay forward the lessons learned that were shared with me by Michael Shawcross over a 20-year period. And in the book, I do my best to highlight through some entertaining stories, 17 of those lessons learned that I'm paying forward to each and every one of you. So without further ado, let's enjoy this evening. First of all, I just want to introduce two organizations that are near and dear to my heart. Engineers Without Borders, which empower communities and equip leaders to solve the world's most pressing challenges. And then Rotary International, which has service over self. It promotes integrity and advances world understanding, goodwill, and peace. And God knows the world could use a little more of all of those during these days. And you can learn more about both these organizations and link to their website by going to the book's website, which is bridgingbarriers.com. How ironic that 2020 is the International Year of the Nurse and Midwife, right in the middle of a pandemic. How crazy is that, right? And the reason that this is the year of the International Nurse and Midwife is it happens to be the 200th anniversary or birthday of Florence Nightingale. And you see, Florence is the founder of modern nursing. And I love this quote that is attributed to her. I attribute my success to this. I never gave or took any excuses. I think those are probably words that all of us can live by. You see, it's that same fierce spirit that lives in the hearts of midwives all around the planet today. This is a picture of 4 midwives in a community called Chupo. And see, midwives are more than just caretakers for new mothers and their infants. They're really in charge of the community's health. They not only deliver those babies, but they treat everything from a machete cut to a stub toe to COVID-19. They're really like a physician's assistant. They're trained, they're certified, and they're professional. The thing that I really admire about these ladies, especially in the Mayan culture, is all of them explained to me that they really didn't have a choice about being a midwife either. They were called by God. And I have to say that I find it very comforting to be treated by a healthcare professional that would be called by their Lord and Maker to do the best they could for my health. I think that's all pretty cool. So this story is really about Gavina, who is the midwife on the right. And she sat with her best friend, Josefa, who's also a midwife in the community of La Garricha. And you can tell these ladies are pros. They've got a lot of experience and a lot of training. They've delivered a lot of babies and they've cured a lot of people of a lot of illnesses. They know how to do their job. But at the time, they were forced to look at 2 major barriers: access to the hospital and clean drinking water. You see, access to the hospital is blocked by the Rio Motagua, which is nicknamed, by the way, the assassin, because of all the people that have died trying to cross it. You see, Gavina tells the story to me about how she would go to a mother's house who was expecting, the time was near, and she would feel that baby and she would know that something was wrong. She knew that it wasn't turned correctly. She knew that that mother needed to go to an immediate C-section, but she couldn't get that mother to the hospital. There was nothing she could do. All she could do is offer words of encouragement to the new mom. And then as she trudged back up to her house, say a silent prayer, hoping for the best possible outcome. These events frustrated her. But the lack of clean water also frustrated her. It plagued her and the other midwives as they tried to take care of the new mothers and their infants, their new patients, because infections would plague them no matter how hard they tried to keep everything clean. Without clean water, it was like trying to fight a fight with one hand behind their back. During this period, 2 to 3 babies were dying each and every year. And one mother, which you need to remember, was one of their friends, one of their neighbors, was also dying due to these barriers to their health care. Sadly, the community is not alone. Do you realize that there's 2 billion people on the face of this planet that lack access to healthcare facilities with adequate water and sanitation? I pray that maybe one of the silver linings that is occurring right now with the pandemic is a realization that we need to rectify that terrible statistic. This is a picture of Gavina's son, Rolando. And I remember the first time that I met him because he just struck me as what an incredible community leader. Rolando is one of those people that, as a leader, he possesses the skill of incredible listening. He looks into people's eyes, he understands, empathizes with their situation, and then works within the community to find a consensus. If you will, community support for whatever the cause may be. And of course, he's committed to do whatever he can to organize the community to break through these barriers that his mother is talking to him constantly about that need to be rectified. This picture is of Don Mike, and he is really the character of all characters. He's a bachelor, a Brit, lived in Guatemala for 40 years. And I think his spirit is really captivated by when he got out of school as a young man, he decided that he was going to hitchhike from England all the way to China with 20 pounds in his pocket. After he got done with that particular adventure, he then went to the Northwest Territories in Canada to explore caves. And he loved caving. He loved everything about it, the exploration, the adventure. He told me that he was amazed that the Canadian government would actually pay him to go and map caves in that region. You see, it was his love of caves that brought him to Guatemala. He went to Guatemala to explore caves, but once he met the Mayan people, he fell in love with them. He loved the way that they were committed to their communities. He loved the culture, and he loved helping people that so much wanted to help themselves. I was the beneficiary of that. For 20 years, Don Mike took me under his wing, and I was his mentee, and he was my mentor. He showed me the ropes. He showed me his lessons learned, his failures, his faults, and his successes. You see, before I met Don Mike, I actually thought I knew a lot of the answers. After I spent some time with him, I clearly knew I didn't even know the questions. One of the stories that Don Mike shares with me is how to receive a solicitation from a community. He stressed this in chapter 4, how important it is that the community solicitation comes from those that are going to benefit, because you cannot help anyone who does not want to be helped. The drive has to come from within the community if the improvements are going to be sustained. This solicitation from the community to remove these barriers is signed by dozens and dozens of sheets like this. And many of the people in the community don't have the ability to read and write, so they sign it with a thumbprint, as you see here on this particular photo. These were all presented to Don Mike at his favorite restaurant in Antigua called Doña Luisa's. And actually, if you ever get to Antigua now, Doña Luisa's is still there. And I would just beg you to go there and try some of the banana bread, because I have to tell you, it is the best on the planet. But during this meeting, as the community explained their trials and tribulations and asked for assistance, Don Mike promised that he would be able to do a thorough assessment, nothing more. He would do his best to look and see what the problems were and offer advice, and if possible, maybe provide assistance. And as the group was getting ready to leave, someone took out a live turkey from underneath their coat. Quite the sight, I think, in the restaurant. And they presented it to Don Mike, and of course, he had no option but to accept it. But after they all left, Don Mike sought out his favorite waitress in the restaurant and gave it to her, because being a bachelor, he had absolutely no idea what to do with the bird. Don Mike then reached out to Engineers Without Borders Marquette. And this is a picture of some of the students with the community on one of the early projects. You see the students really were committed to this particular project. And Marquette's motto is be the difference. And these students were determined that they were going to be the difference for this community to breaking these barriers. They worked tirelessly on this project, raising funds, working on the design, coordinating on materials with Don Mike. It was an incredible adventure for them, and they were not going to stumble. But as Don Mike would say, in chapter 6, you always have to be prepared for surprises. And we were surprised when we started the bridge construction. During the excavation, it started to rain, and then it started to pour. And then the rain started going sideways, and then I swear the rain actually came up from the ground. We didn't know what was going on, and frankly, I was being a little bit crabby because we were behind schedule. And then Rolando came by and explained that this storm actually had a name, Hurricane Stan. And later we would learn that 3,000 Guatemaltecos lost their life during this event. We had no idea. There was no cell phones and no radio service down in the bottom of the valley. But during this time, it also is a place where Don Mike showed me his true heart. You see, one of the workers, his name is Juan. And Juan happens to have Down syndrome. And he's a young man in his early 20s, and he's excited about this work. It's his first chance to go and work with the other men in the community, kind of like a coming out party for him. He went down in the excavation and threw himself at the 90-pound jackhammers, making sure that he could demonstrate that he could do a man's job. But as the raging river got higher and higher and things were slippery, Don Mike and Juan's father got very concerned about the safety of Juan and his co-workers because he was being a bit reckless. So finally, Don Mike called Juan up out of the excavation. And initially, Juan protested. He said, no, don't worry. I'm fine. I don't need a break. And then he realized that it was only him that was being asked to leave the work site. He came up out of the hole and came to Don Mike, and his head was hung low. And Don Mike put his hands on his shoulders, asked him to look up at him, and then immediately praised him for all of his work. He told Juan that he'd never seen such a jackhammer operator in all of his years. But he had a more important job for Juan to do at this point in time. He needed Juan to go sit upriver a little bit and look out for any trees that might be washing down the river that could possibly jeopardize the rest of the work crew. Well, of course, Juan looked at him and said he would accept that challenge. He'd love to be able to help out. And he went and perched himself on that rock, and I swear he never even wiped the water off of his face as he dutifully did his job, shrieking out a warning to the rest of the workers anytime a tree would come anywhere near. This just demonstrated to me the heart of Don Mike, and I loved him for it. This picture actually is when we'd had the official groundbreaking ceremony on site. Now, this particular bridge would service 14 communities, 7 on the south side of the river, 7 on the north. The communities on the south side of the river were Quechiquel Mayans. The communities on the north, Quiche Mayans. Sometimes they were allies, sometimes they were enemies. They spoke different languages. They couldn't understand each other in their native tongue. But we had a huge celebration when we broke ground for the project. And after we'd eaten mountains and mountains of tortillas and caldo de pollo, which is chicken soup, we put everybody to work. And this picture shows everybody passing the heavy stones that would build a temporary support in the middle of the river that would hold up the concrete bridge as it cured. This was a really important event as I look back on it, because people had to stand next to their neighbors and pass heavy stones to each other, relying on each other, and they could see something visible happen. The pier would rise right up out of the middle of the river. And after we completed this with so many hands working side by side, I think all of us realized we could actually do this project. This is one of my favorite photos because it says so many different things to different people. The engineers probably see the 3 concrete mixers that are working simultaneously to provide the concrete for the bridge deck. Some people notice the wheelbarrows that are in an endless loop, bringing the concrete out and placing it where it's needed on the bridge. Others maybe look at the students working side by side with the community members. And then my wife will point out right in the middle of the photo, the 2 ladies that are running across the temporary bridge with baskets of tortillas on their heads to feed the workers. It's just amazing to me how one photo says so many different things to so many people. After the bridge was done, Gavina reminded us our work wasn't done yet. She still needed clean water for her to be able to do her job. This picture shows the route of a spring, which is in Shekashol down in the lower left, and it would flow to the community by gravity to the center of the picture and then down to all the different people through their branch system. The total amount of pipeline, 20 miles. If you live in Wisconsin, that's like a pipeline that goes from Milwaukee to Waukesha. But I like this photo better because it shows the type of terrain that this pipeline would need to traverse. This is the 5-mile section that would go from the spring to the tank. And you can see that it goes over mountains, through valleys, through forests, and even some fields. And then you realize that this trench, all 20 miles of it, needs to be dug by hand. The work teams were incredible, all volunteer. They would come out and Mincho, our foreman, would assign each worker 10 meters to excavate. And they would, depending on their luck, maybe they would dig through soil. Maybe they would have to dig through rock. Maybe it would be through tree stumps and roots. Again, all by hand. But it was also during this summer when we got to know the community much better. You see, at this time, we had our very first Engineers Without Borders fellow, Amy, that spent the entire summer working down there, along with a Peace Corps volunteer, Katie, who was assigned to the project. And we all lived in a house with our masons. And in the evenings, of course, we would sit around a makeshift fireplace made of a wheelbarrow full of sand and talk about each other's culture and learn more about how we lived. And the 2 stories that jumped into my mind were first when Katie was explaining to the people the concept of ice fishing. You have to realize Guatemaltecos love to fish. And the idea that you could actually walk out on a lake on the ice and then chip a hole through that ice. And then Katie would demonstrate doing the hand over hand activity to show how you would pull the fish out onto the top of the frozen lake. They were just absolutely mesmerized. And then Amy got into the act with her story about sports. The Guatemaltecos love playing football, or what we would call soccer. And she said, yes, they played soccer, and actually Amy's a pretty good soccer player. But then she took on the task of explaining a different sport that's played in the United States and Canada called hockey, or as Guatemaltecos would say, hockey. And she explained that it was very similar, except instead of a soccer field, you play on a sheet of ice and you have to wear skates. But you hit the puck, which happens to be frozen and made of rubber, into a net that's defended by a goalie, just like football. And she would demonstrate as she would hit the puck with a stick that was the puck was maybe made out of a block of wood, and the community just would howl and howl, laughing at at her antics as she was explaining this crazy new sport called hockey. And we all got to learn much more about each other. Finally, the water was complete. And in the people in this photo, they don't look very happy, right? But I have to say it's because they pose in the traditional Guatemalan manner of not smiling and showing their teeth. But trust me, they're ready to burst with joy. I never tire of turning on a water system for the first time. And I've been blessed to be able to do this dozens of times throughout my career. You see, you turn on the water up at the top of the mountain, and as it flows down to the first family by gravity, and it finally comes out of that tap, the entire family shouts with joy. And then the water flows down by gravity to the next house, and then the next house, and the next. And each of them receives the same exclamation of joy as it comes to them. It's something that's absolutely unforgettable. You see, the reason for this joy is this mother knows that her entire life she's had to carry water from the river to support her community and her home. That's the same task that her mother did, and her grandmother, and her great-grandmother. And now she knows that her daughters will no longer have to be treated like beasts of burden to carry water from the river to their home. She no longer has to make the unbelievable choice of which of her daughters will be able to go to school and which will have to stay home and tote water. I remember when Gavina was explaining this to me and the anger in her voice as she told me the story, because you see, she knows these people. She knows these girls. She brought them into this world. She knows that they're smart, intelligent, and could contribute to the community in so many ways if they weren't relegated to being beasts of burden to carry water to their home. Now that the clean water is available at each and every one of the homes, their world has been opened up. After the water system was completed, it was tested time and time again. One of the biggest tests we had was when Hurricane Agatha came. And during that event, there was actually a portion of a mountain that slid down and blocked the route of the Rio Motagua until finally the river overcrested that earthen dam and created a wave of water as it broke all the way down to the Atlantic Ocean. And in that stretch of over 700 miles, every bridge was destroyed. Every bridge but one. I saw this picture in the paper when I was down responding to the disaster for the government, not in the La Garucha area, but in other neighboring regions. And I saw this picture of Rolando standing in front of the bridge with the title, "The Unbeatable Bridge." Was certainly an amazing feeling to see that in that newspaper article. You know, since then, this bridge continues to be an item of legend, and I get questions about it to this day. All kinds of stories. And the one thing that I believe now that's larger than fishing stories is bridge building stories. And the rumors just go on and on and on. Maybe a special Mayan ceremony protected the bridge. Maybe you mixed the concrete with bull's blood to make it stronger. But in the end, I always have to admit, it was just dumb luck that allowed the bridge to survive. You know, as a civil engineer, it's not very often that you get a chance to go back and review your work and see the impact after 10 years of the project being in existence. That was the blessing that I was able to have 2 years ago when we revisited La Garucha to see how things were doing. Not only was the bridge being used to transport commerce and people to the healthcare facilities and education centers, but also all of the taps but two, 98%, were completely working the day that we went and visited. But the amazing thing to me was how the community took charge of their future after those barriers were removed. They formed health committees that included the school and the new clinic. They formed advocacy groups to keep an eye on the most vulnerable in their community and accompany them to the hospital if needed, arranging for transportation. Because you need to realize many people had never left their community, and it's very scary to go to the hospital for the first time. Gavina and the midwives worked with the school director to have health and hygiene training in the school, but also at night for the adults. And then every time the midwives would visit the homes, they would reinforce good health and hygiene activities, making sure that people didn't fall back into the old ruts and bad habits. The results? Amazing. Completely eliminating the maternal and infant mortality. School absences were reduced from 300 per month to 2. Yeah, 300 to 2. And there were more people in the school. All the girls were now in school because they were no longer required to be beasts of burden to fetch water. Once these barriers were removed, the community broke free. Now, let's fast forward to the pandemic today. Engineers Without Borders and Rotary have teamed up again to work with local manufacturers and help them manufacture personal protective equipment for healthcare workers in the country. And I have to say, I'm worried about the midwives. Many are of vulnerable ages, and I know they will not abandon their patients. As Gavina told me, babies won't stop for the virus. So I'm asking each of you tonight, when you go home and you hit your knees, to say a little prayer for the protection of healthcare workers all around the world. Now, Gavina had heard about tonight's event, and she wanted to send a message. Because you see, as much as I worry about her, she's worried about all of us. She's heard about the terrible virus and how it's impacted the United States. And so this is the message that she sends to you this evening.
Mike, it doesn't look like your computer sound is sharing.
Always the educator, Gavina tells us once again, wash your hands. So you can purchase the book 3 ways. There's an ebook that's available for $2.99. You can buy a paperback. And if you have the means and would like to make an additional donation of $20, you can buy a signed edition by Kathy Leslie and Bernard and myself. And of course, all the proceeds from the book will go to the Guatemala program. So I'd like to thank you again tonight for coming. And I'd like to introduce my friend, Kathy Leslie, the Executive Director of Engineers Without Borders, for a few comments.
Thanks, Mike. It's such a delight to see the launch of this book at long last, because as I read it a few months ago, I was really taken back to those early days of Engineers Without Borders when I was a volunteer and I was actually heading out to a community. It remains a mystery to me how communities are still underserved in terms of water, sanitation, healthcare, and other things. And today, more than ever, with climate change and pandemics like COVID-19, sustainable infrastructure is so crucial to the future, to my grandchildren, to yours, and to everybody else's on this call. The projects that you talk about in the book, or that I've worked on, demonstrate that communities are plenty knowledgeable about what they need. And a part of what they need are volunteers who know how to build and maintain that water system, that healthcare facility, that bridge for the long term, and so it can be maintained. We are those volunteers, and I'd like to thank everybody for not only your interest, but your service to those underserved communities. Enjoy the book. I enjoyed it highly, and I really hope that we can take the lessons learned in the book into the future for communities. So next, I would like to introduce you all to our founder, Dr. Bernard Amadei. I've known Bernard since 2003 when he recruited me as a mentor for a project in Mali. Bernard is certainly a disruptor in engineering education when it comes to building sustainable infrastructures to communities in need. We've been in many different places together, and one of my favorite recollections is from 2004, where we were able to share a cold drink in Sekou, Mali, as we were waiting for a donkey to bring our pipe from the equivalent of Home Depot. The weather was hot, over 100 degrees, and humid as the rainy season was just about to start. And we've been working together ever since. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bernard. Bernard?
Thank you, Kathy. And first of all, I want to congratulate Mike, the students, all people who were involved in this project for what you guys have done, which is more than just engineering, in my opinion. I had the privilege of reading the book and that Mike wrote, and he's a great writer, and he's also a great storyteller, and he's a great engineer, and I'm sure he's a great dad and a great friend and a great husband. So the book that I read from Mike, I think that if you are not convinced that engineering is about helping people and making the world a better place, it's about fulfilling dreams at the local level, then please read that book, because that book, as I mentioned in my endorsement, will really change the way you look at engineering, look at our profession, and that our profession is more than just coming up with technology to solve specific issues, but rather it's about coming up with some solutions to improve the well-being and the livelihood of communities around the world, including poor communities in the United States. What I like about the book is the diversity. It reads like a story, and the power of the story is so powerful here. It talks about engineering, of course, but it also talks about the human dimension of engineering. And I hope you captured the statement that Mike made, looking at the bridge at the end there. That bridge is more than just concrete and stones and steel and what have you there. The bridge essentially changes communities entirely, allows essentially communities to go from one side to the other side, from an economic point of view, from a health point of view, from a social point of view. So next time you guys are doing some work for Engineers Without Borders or any engineering work, as a matter of fact, remember that engineering has a social dimension, also has a cultural dimension, and it essentially brings fulfilled dreams that people have. So I also liked reading about the friendship that Mike developed with Don Mike. Someone reminded me that I met Don Mike once in my lifetime. I don't remember, to be frank with you. But sure enough, Don Mike sounds like a very interesting fellow. And it's beautiful to read how Michael is documenting the friendship between the two with the other Mike. Lots of wisdom in this book, I can tell you that. When you read it slowly and think about how important the engineering profession is all about. As I mentioned in my write-up there, wisdom is not learned in books. It can only be learned through experience in the field and in a hard way through several cycles and trial and error. As you all know, if you have done work for Engineers Without Borders, working in the developing world is not easy. And that's the way it is. Coming up with one solution that fits everybody, that's not possible. So it's about trial and error, because we don't know what we don't know. So I want to finish my endorsement there by saying that please read this book, publicize this book. As Mike mentioned, the proceeds of this book will help communities in Guatemala. This is one of the many projects that Engineers Without Borders is doing. So I just want to thank Mike, thank the students, thank the volunteers, and thank all of you who are involved in Engineers Without Borders work for your commitment, for your passion, for your caring, for your compassion, for your love, and also for making the world a better place. So thank you, Mike, for showing us the way and sharing with us your beautiful story.
Thank you so much for that wonderful endorsement, Bernard. Mike, I just want to say congratulations for your book launch, for sharing with us this incredible story. But in this moment, most of all, congratulate you for being the first to actually finally change my perspective on engineering and the impact, the enormous impact that it can truly make. And I think that'll make my dad very proud. But also, it's an impressive example of how you and your volunteers, Engineers Without Borders, were able to harness the energy and really encourage as many volunteers in the community to help their community, and but more so for being able to come together and make this incredible impact that will change their potential for the future. And I think you touched on that it has made such a huge difference even in the families' lives already. One of the first questions I have is, how did you meet Don Mike?
Well, of course, that comes with a story as well, right? So Don Mike, I met him on a project when I was brought there by a gentleman out of another civil engineer who was working on service projects in the Waukesha area. His name is Paul Johnson, another one of my mentors. And believe it or not, Paul and I did not meet in Waukesha. We met at an ice cream store in Bolivia, where I was delivering some survey equipment to him, woefully late, by the way, and terrified of the anger that I was going to see. And Don Pablo, he embraced me, knew that the work that we were doing was important. And of course, he's the nicest man on the planet and fully understood. But the way Don Pablo tells the story is, I might have gotten that survey equipment for an extra week. He got me in Guatemala working with him for 20 years. It was that connection that Paul Johnson made for me back up into Guatemala, working with Marquette University students at the time. And this is before Engineers Without Borders was even formed, where we were able to work together, meet Don Mike, and Don Mike took me under his wing.
Wow. Well, speaking of Don Mike, I just want to get a couple of questions here that stem from that. Can you take one of Don Mike's lessons and tell how you've applied it in one of your most recent projects, like the Guatemalan PPE project?
Yeah, I think, Don Mike showed me that, again, one of the most important lessons is to listen and truly listen to feedback from people. And I think as we've worked on the personal protective equipment manufacturing with Dana Alcock and our Dana Cook and Rebecca Alcock and Jess Thayer, we've learned that what we needed to do is come up with our prototypes, submit those in small batches to 12 different hospitals and get feedback from them on what they liked and what they didn't like, and then change our designs. I think it's like Bernard said, engineering really is centered on humans. And we have to always remember that human beings are using our product and make sure that it's human-based design.
Of course. And I think that's really important because as you mentioned in our introduction many months ago, that you told me, I'm sure you pictured an engineer as someone sitting behind a desk and taking a lot of measurements and such. So I think it's so critical to make sure that we all remember that it can make such an incredible impact, human impact. The other question that has come up is, of all the countries that you have worked in, which one has been your favorite?
Oh, wow. That's a tough question, but actually when I think about it, maybe not that difficult. You know, I've worked on 5 different continents now, doing over 100 projects in many countries. But I always am drawn back to Guatemala. And I think it's that same spirit that captured Don Mike's heart. You know, it's the people who love to work for themselves, help themselves, that sense of community in the Mayan culture that keeps bringing me back. And I have to say that over the years, I've learned to appreciate that much more, because some other locations don't have that same community spirit and camaraderie to work together that we see in the highlands of Guatemala. And now I truly appreciate the special people that they truly are.
Well, and of course, the volunteer participation and buy-in from the community is critical to such an to accomplish such a project. What, who or how do you raise the funds? Who provides the funds to be able to do this?
Yeah, we talk about that quite a bit in the book, of the different adventures on how to raise funds. And I think one thing that working on these projects has taught me is how to be comfortable asking for donations from individuals and corporations for projects. You know, the students raise the money primarily through all kinds of events: selling cheese sandwiches on campus, bags of coffee, the 1,000-letter campaign, as they call it, where they send a note to all of their relatives at Christmas time and ask them, don't give me a Christmas present, send me $20 instead. And it's amazing, because if you have 1,000 letters and they all come back with $20, guess what? You've got $20,000. Of course, Rotary's been a key part in this for us over the years as well. Not only for helping us raise funds, but making connections to businesses, helping us get discounts, and those kinds of things. Especially, I think, in the later years here, we've learned how to really work in partnership with Rotarians and value their input and their leadership as well on these projects. And it just makes the projects go all that much better.
Of course. It definitely makes projects go much better when you have a collaboration of everybody, your volunteers, the organizers. I want to get to this one question. Have you, well, first of all, thanks for living your God-given purpose, Mike. Happy to have learned from you while I was a student at MSOE. Have you learned any lessons from humanitarian engineering works that you were able to apply into your USA professional career?
You know, for a while there, I thought maybe we should build projects like the Marquette Interchange using just community volunteer labor. But I was never able to convince Governor Thompson that that would be a good idea. But I think that the idea that, again, recognizing that all of the engineering work is truly human-centered and getting feedback and truly listening to people about what their concerns are is something that's helped me out throughout my engineering career, especially on the transportation projects, because they impact so many lives. And you see the fear of people, for example, when we built the Marquette Interchange, including Marquette University, that they were afraid that they would not be able to get people to and from the university with the freeway impacted. And so to be able to listen to those, have empathy for the comments, and then be able to address them and build consensus is very important, not only in international work, but in our everyday engineering lives, no matter where it might be.
Another question that has come in, and that is related to directly to the community of Guatemala. How were you able to foster that level of collaboration between the communities? Did the project bring them closer together?
Yeah, that's always interesting. That something that I've learned, especially like in disaster response. But in this particular case, I'm going to give all of the credit to Don Rolando. He was the great collaborator and convener of these different communities and bringing them to consensus on where the bridge would go, right? You need to locate the bridge. Where's the right spot? And is this the priority for the communities to work on? All of those things took a lot of time and effort and listening. And so we were able to just come in on Don Rolando's coattails, so to speak, and work with him after he had built that kind of relationship within the communities. But I will say that when it comes to disasters, sometimes the engineering projects are very much a part of mending that torn community fabric. You see, on a disaster, just like the 2 hurricanes that I talked about in this book, you see that the first step is the communities lose faith in their government. And then they lose faith in their families and their leaders. And ultimately, they may even lose faith in themselves. And I've seen, for example, in the volcano response, where communities who were close before now didn't trust each other because they were doubting each other. Why didn't you help me more during this terrible disaster? Why didn't you do more to help my family? Through a common project where people worked together side by side for a common goal, started to heal some of those wounds and mend some of that torn fabric of the community. And that's something I never really anticipated from an engineering project. And it's one of the very important unintended consequences, I would say, from some of these projects.
Well, and speaking of unintended consequences, another question that came through is the national government a help or a hindrance to your activities in Guatemala?
The national government is a great supporter of our work. And we always work, Don Mike taught me a long time ago that it's much easier to do the projects without the government. But it's very important to collaborate with the government and start to build that relationship between people and their government so that they know that they have a say in their government. Guatemalan's a democracy. So if you don't like your leaders, you can vote them out. If you need to have more services, you can advocate for them. That important step is needed and an important part of the project. For example, now with our work with in the post-volcano experience, I had a group, a whole platoon of Army Corps of Engineers that worked side by side with me on the bridge projects. So now our projects are more coordinated at the national level with the government as well as the local government on what are the priorities and needs. And in fact, in Guatemala, Steve and Valeska Crow do an excellent job of making sure that there's significant financial participation in the projects from local government too, to get their buy-in and endorsement in the long-term sustainability.
Well, and speaking of the other than the community buy-in that you mentioned, what are the most important considerations when determining which project to take on? And how has your view on this changed over time?
I remember one of the early days when I rode with Don Mike, and I asked him, at the time, how many projects he was doing through the organization PAVA, which was a Guatemala NGO. And he said they were doing about 10 projects. And he explained to me that they were getting about 100 solicitations each and every year. And then I asked him, well, how many projects do you think you could do if you had won the lottery and you had all the money available to you? And he said about 10. And the reason for that is Don Mike was emphatic that you had to make sure that you were doing the right project for the right people at the right time. And if you didn't have all 3 of those things coming into alignment, the project may not be sustainable, likely would not. And I think that's why his projects have stood the test of time. He's worked there for 40 years, and I had yet to find a failed project that Don Mike worked on. And I can tell you that it provides a lot of frustration for people because sometimes the projects take a very long time to develop to make sure that those 3 things all line up. I remember one water project that we worked on, we waited 10 years for the community to get consensus. Another bridge, 12 years before they decided exactly where it would be placed. Many times donors don't have that kind of patience. They come and say, here's the money, I need it spent by the end of this year or by the end of next year. And Don Mike would just turn that money back to the donors and say, I'm not going to build the wrong project for the wrong people at the wrong time. It's just not an option. I think more organizations, if they understood that, and more donors, if they understood that, would really contribute to having less failed projects on this planet.
It's a very good point to make, lesson in prioritizing projects and funds, of course. You mentioned that you rode around with Don Mike. One interesting question, and perhaps we can end with this one, is, although I do have a little announcement to make after you answer this question. What is your favorite means of transportation to get around rural Guatemala?
So there's a whole chapter in the book that's dedicated to Don Mike's Land Cruiser. It was really his calling card. And it was a 1983 Land Cruiser that drank gasoline like a funnel. I mean, it was incredible. But that vehicle could go through anything. And Don Mike loved that vehicle. And wherever he went, people recognized that white Land Cruiser as being his vehicle, and it was his kind of calling card that he would come around. And I loved riding around and driving that truck. And it was mainly because just about the time that you were wondering why you were doing what you were doing, someone would come up and they would come to the vehicle and they'd introduce themselves and ask Don Mike if he remembered them. And he would say probably no, because he'd met so many people in the Highlands. And then the person would explain that they were maybe 5 years old when Don Mike had built the school in their community. And now they'd grown up, graduated, went to the university, and were the school director. Those kinds of events just showed me how much of a change one person could really make in people's lives. And that happened time and time again when I rode around in that crazy old white Land Cruiser. And by the way, the Land Cruiser still goes on. It's plowing fields in Guatemala, helping farmers plant their corn. Amazing.
Wow. Well, I could see how you were inspired by Don Mike to write this story, to share this story with everyone. And so on that note, I do want to remind everyone that if you did pre-order a book already, they will be mailed out at the end of next week. And if you haven't pre-ordered a book but are very interested in it after listening to this presentation, you may obtain a book at orangehatpublishing.com. And that is the best way to obtain the book where you can buy the signed version. And again, any version that you buy, all the proceeds are going back to this community in Guatemala. I'm getting a couple of questions here, so just want to make sure I addressed everything. But yes, signed copies with the option to purchase a special edition with funds going to EWB Guatemala are at orangehatpublishing.com. And as soon as you get the book and you're done reading it, would love and appreciate your review on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. Of course, that'll help with Mike's book and the rankings. It's doing very well so far. So, but I'll turn it back to Mike. Again, congratulations. And Mike, it's on you.
Well, just quickly, I'll wrap things up and thank you all again for taking the time out of your busy evenings to join me this night. And I'd love to be able to sit around with you again, maybe in person next time when the crazy coronavirus period is ended. We'll have a beer or two and I can even share a few more stories with you. So thank you so much for coming and have a good evening. And as Gavina would say, make sure you wash your hands.